So just a little bit about the Athabasca River. Minister Renner did talk about the fact that it isn't like some of our southern basins. It hasn't been completely allocated. But we definitely see that more as an opportunity to make sure that it's managed properly up front. The Athabasca River is a highly variable river across years as well as across seasons. And industry is currently licensed to withdraw up to 15% of instantaneous flows. So you'll often hear that even with projected increases in production, that 2% number tends to be put out there that we're only going to use up to 2% of the river. Well, that's on an annual basis, whereas the concerns really relate to low flow periods and aquatic needs during those periods. And again, Mr. Renner also talked about the importance of a natural flow paradigm, where there's the low and the high flows, but both of those provide important aquatic functions. So even during high flows, there's still flooding that takes place to create fish habitat and other functions of the system. And then during low flow periods, it's important to make sure that there's enough water there to fulfill aquatic ecosystem needs. So this is just a chart showing some of the variability. So this is the flow of the Athabasca River charted from 1957 to 2002. If you go across the chart from left to right, that's just the seasonal differences. And then if you go between the two purple lines, that's the variability across different years. So as you can see, it's really highly variable. So what is an ecosystem base flow? Ecosystem base flow is a low flow where further water withdrawals could pose an unacceptable risk to aquatic ecosystems and could damage them significantly. A flow where it is appropriate for water withdrawals to cease, and a minimum standard for many stakeholder groups. There's a growing importance to recognize the need of an ecological base flow, especially in the face of climate change, and how that could impact different flow rates. So right now, the Phase 1 framework is in effect for the Athabasca River. It's to provide protective limits on the Athabasca River, but there are currently no enforcement mechanisms associated with that framework. So although there is a green, a yellow, and a red period, the red period basically showing that flows are quite low compared to historical flows. And so there's a potential significant impact to aquatic ecosystems at that time. There's no point at which it's required with legislation for companies to stop withdrawing from the Athabasca River. It's suggested that they do within the framework, but as it stands right now, it's voluntary. So for that reason, many non-industry stakeholders consider Phase 1 to be inadequate for that reason. So Phase 2 was a multi-stakeholder group that actually just concluded at the end of January, and they were tasked to recommend withdrawal rules for cumulative oil sands development building upon Phase 1 and balance between the social, economic, and environmental interests. So it's recognized that there would be trade-offs within that process. And at the end of the day, there was no consensus reached between those stakeholders because more than one stakeholder group identified that it was unacceptable for there to be no ecosystem-based flow where industry would agree to cease withdrawals. It's currently in public consultation phase, so you might hear more about it. But it's really an opportunity for regulators to show leadership. So they have the public consultation period, and then the regulators are ultimately responsible for coming up with what that Phase 2 is going to look like. And there are options such as off-stream storage and that type of thing, but there should be a point at which it's recognized that aquatic needs take precedence over industrial needs. So tailings ponds. Tailings ponds, or lakes as we like to call them because they're very large, they cover over 130 square kilometers, contain process-affected waters with unrecovered hydrocarbons and naphthenic acids. There's been an accumulation of over 720 billion liters of toxic waste on the landscape because they cannot return the water once it's been affected by the process. It cannot be returned into the aquatic environment. There's concerns about seepage. There was direct seepage to the river from an old tailings pond called Tar Island Dike, which was one of the first ones. And that's since been cleaned up. But there's no public information available on how much seepage is occurring or where it's occurring. And we ended up looking into it, and there's just no publicly available information is there. A group called Environmental Defense actually looked into the environmental impact assessments that are put out by the companies and came up with an estimate of seepage based on what was in those reports and came up with 11 million liters per day. But in the face of not having any publicly available information, that's really hard to determine. And there's a lot of concerns around monitoring of tailing seepage. So where are the mature fine tailings, which is, that's the byproduct that's hard to deal with within the tailings pond. So where are those supposed to end up? Well, according to the applications that have been put out by oil sands developers, they're supposed to end up in end pit lakes. So this is a cartoon diagram of what's supposed to happen with an end pit lake. So mature fine tailings is basically the consistency of yogurt. And so the plan is to have the mature fine tailings put into a pit and then capped with fresh water. And the hope is that the fresh water and the tailings don't mix. And that ecosystem would basically become functioning over time. No one has been able to prove that an end pit lake can function, yet we continue to approve projects based on the fact that they're going to produce these end pit lakes at the end. So there's a lot of uncertainty as to what's going to happen. We were really happy to see last year that one of the regulators, the Energy Resources Conservation Board, came up with a new tailings directive called Directive 74. So this was new rules to regulate liquid tailings in the face that a lot of operators weren't meeting the tailings reclamation targets that they had put out in their original proposals.